We will begin with the formal program. Good morning. I can say good morning. Good morning. I'm Adam Lupel, IPI Vice President, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to this event, Protecting Civilians and Managing Threats, Non-State Armed Groups, Violent Extremism, and the Role of UN Peace Operations, which has been co-organized with the Directorate General for International Relations and Strategy of the French Ministry of the Armed Forces and the Government of the Kingdom of the Netherlands. Many thanks to both of them for their partnership today and in the past, and we trust in the future. This event forms part of IPI's 2-year project on the protection of civilians, POC, led by IPI Research Fellow Dr. Nami Derasa. There she is in the front row. We'll see her later. The project aims at promoting a common understanding of what POC means in the context of peace operations, supporting the UN Secretariat and peace operations in policy development and in the implementation of POC, and providing both field-based research and convening space to discuss, analyze, and address the many challenges to this implementation. More analytically, the project looks to anchor POC in clear political strategies for tailored and impact-driven approaches, clarify roles and responsibilities for a better use of armed and unarmed strategies, and to enhance the accountability system for POC. These are all ambitious objectives, to be sure, for a 2-year project. But I think we can all agree that if UN peace operations fail demonstrably in their mandates to protect civilians, the consequences would be broad. The UN as a whole is often judged on the fate of the civilians seeking protection under its flag. Today's event offers the opportunity then to examine in depth several aspects of POC and our work. We are simultaneously launching 2 policy reports today, which I think might be unprecedented to do that twice in one day. And for that, actually, I'd like to give a shout out to our publications team, who all too often go unthanked, editor Albert Trithart and assistant editor Gretchen Baldwin. Many thanks to them for all that they do behind the scenes. They make it look easy, but it's not. We have 2 great panels today. First, we will have a discussion of engaging with non-armed groups to protect civilians, and then after a keynote speech over lunch by Mr. Jack Christofides, who I'm sure many of you know, we will have a discussion of protection of civilians in context of violent extremism, looking in depth at the case of Mali. So please stick around. It promises to be a fantastic day. We do clearly have a lot to cover, and so I will say no more. But before we move on to our panels, we will have further welcoming remarks from our partners, General Thierry Léon, Senior Military Advisor, Permanent Mission of France to the United Nations, and Rear Admiral Peter van den Berg, Senior Military Advisor, Permanent Mission of the Kingdom of the Netherlands to the UN. I think you have full bios in your program, so I will not introduce them more. We will then also have opening remarks by Ms. Aiko Ikugaya, Division of Policy, Evaluation, and Training, DPET, UNDPKO, and DFS. And with that, I will cede the floor. General Léon, the floor is yours. Welcome.
Thank you. Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Directeur. Merci à IPI et également merci au Royaume de Netherlands, l'autre pays du fromage. Oh, so I can understand that you understand French. So I can follow on French. Okay, no. Okay, I will shift in English. But it's not my favorite language, and I would like to excuse me first. Thank you very much, all of us, to be there for this very important subject, of course, an issue. Thank you, Nami, because I know that you worked a lot on this issue, which is very difficult. And as you mentioned many times, POC, it's not the same when you are in Central African Republic, when you are in Mali, when you are in all the other countries. So we have to adapt. It's not just only a matter of theory. That is something that we have to deal with And first, the center of gravity of everywhere in the world is the population. Why? Because population is the target, the objective. We have to gain the heart. But the bad guys have to gain the heart of the population too, because they need the populations. And so it's difficult for all of us, of course, because we have to try to keep on the good side of the line the populations. But in the day and on the field, it's another story. But we have to deal with that here in New York, comfortably seated here. But we have to discuss and to think about this. So, peacekeeping, yes, saves lives, including in countries marked by systematic violence committed by the armed groups and terrorist organizations. Past failures to prevent and to halt such crimes against civilian populations led the Security Council and the Secretariat to place the protection of civilians high on their respective agenda. The reason why protective civilians is a duty and a mission of more than 95% of blue helmets today. And this includes an active and deterrent posture and presence in areas under greatest threats. Such evolution is motivated by simple facts: the legitimacy and credibility of both peacekeeping missions and peace processes in conflict areas relies first and foremost on the safety and security of civilians, regardless the nature of perpetrators of crimes, states, armed groups, terrorist organizations. However, these positive developments of doctrine have not translated into systematic and consistent protection of civilians on the field. Figures on both civilian and peacekeeper casualties are alarming. For instance, in 2017, tens of thousands of soldiers were killed and 53 peacekeepers have lost their lives. That is why peace operations and troop-contributing countries must take into account new realities and challenges. This effort is the price of missions' effectiveness in the implementation of their mandate. So, enhancing performance and resilience of peacekeepers is a prerequisite, very difficult in English, for effective protection of civilian population in non-permissive environments. Blue helmets need to get all the necessary means and support on the ground to carry out their protection of civilians' mandate. We must, for instance, make sure that peacekeeping forces have access to intelligence and technological tools they need to face today's challenges. Efficiency of troops and training, including skills to deal in asymmetric environments, are imperative both for the successful implementation of mandates and blue helmet safety and security. It's also essential to put in place a genuine performance evaluation and address underperformance cases through a frank and open exchange between the Secretariat, the Security Council, and the contributing countries. In view of these needs, France supports UN Secretariat and contributing troop countries efforts to strengthen peace operations performance. Through our bilateral partnerships and our security and defense cooperations, France contributes to the training and equipment of many contingents. In Africa, for example, France trains more than 30,000 soldiers per year, officers and soldiers. Operational and deployment support is also key to empowering states in the fight against terrorism, as we are doing with the G5 cell. Protecting civilians in a non-permissive environment is not only peacekeeping nor a new responsibility of uniformed personnel. Our support for country capacity building runs in synergy with other protection actors present on the field: host nation, UN Protection Agency, regional and sub-regional organizations, non-governmental organizations. Today, more than yesterday, less than tomorrow, perhaps, the multiplication of actors on the grounds and the fields imposes a rigorous coordination of their actions, as all of them are complementary. I'm sure of this because it was my experience in the Central African Republic. All of us, we are complementary. So I think that in history, perhaps we have ideological barriers or obstacles. Now, today, nothing. Only one purpose, the population, and nothing else. So this is why we are here together here today to identify where possible coherent and mutually reinforcing action. Thank you very much. Bye bye.
Thank you.
Merci mon ami Thierry, le champion de vin et le champion de football. Dear Adam, thank you for giving me the word and distinguished panels, honorable guests, other speakers. Thank you for being here. I will keep it short. We have a full day ahead of us and it will be a very interesting and exciting day, I think. I must say also that I'm impressed by the high turnout. It underlines, I think, the strong interest in the topic at hand. It also underlines that we still haven't solved the difficulties we come across, providing protection to civilians in complex, volatile and asymmetric environments. I think we all know the ongoing normative discourse on protection of civilians. But I think that this discourse also gives, inadvertently, rise to expectation which can't be met by our peacekeepers, or perhaps we should say them peace operators, on the ground within their own existing means. I'm a military advisor, and as a military advisor, I'm a firm believer of integrated assessment and planning. Assessment and planning to make full use of the potential of the whole UN in order to act proactively. On the other hand, there's also a need to enhance our situational awareness within the missions itself, what is going on the ground, just to make sure that our scarce resources are used effectively across the whole spectrum of tools, including dialogue and also engagement. I've got lots of paper, but that's because of my eyesight. A few moments ago, we discussed the vulnerable link between POC and political strategies. One of the issues raised was the tendency to militarize the protection of civilian mandate, with the risk of it becoming divorced from the political goals. On the other hand, the use of force in peacekeeping operations remains a necessity, especially in volatile areas. It should, however, be part of the toolbox of protection of civilian strategies. To be effective, armed and unarmed strategies should be used in full concert with each other. This morning, while standing in the elevator, I read the little screen, the advertisement screen, which is, let's say, in our elevator when going up to the 19th floor. And on that floor was a quote from Henry Ford, which is, I think, very relevant for today's discussions. And we all know Henry Ford, I do hope so, the guy from the T-Fords. But of course, this is American car, you all know them. But in the 1920s, he said the following: if I had asked people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses. And looking at the topic at hand, yes, I fully agree, we can do better on POC. But I think we can't solve the problem with that if we stick to our normal routines and policies. Today's seminar will address many outstanding issues on protection of civilian and managing threats. It will also raise difficult questions, and I do hope we can help the search for answers to those questions. The Netherlands is co-sponsor of this event, which is part of the full project of IPI mentioned by Adam. A project not only to raise questions, but also to make tangible recommendations. It is a project which touches upon avenues which seems to be forgotten or have been too difficult to discuss, and let's use this momentum. The Netherlands is proud to be a sponsor of such an impressive and valuable research project. I thank you for your attention and wish you a very interesting day. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Terry. Thank you, Peter, for those welcoming remarks. And thank you for the call out for the research and for the support. We really, really appreciate that. We will now turn to our further opening remarks from Ms. Aiko Ikagaya, who is Deputy Chief of Policy and Best Practices Service, Division of Policy, Evaluation and Training, United Nations Department of Peacekeeping Operations and Department of Field Support. Aiko, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you very much, and I'm very honored to be here. I'd like to thank IPI and, of course, as well as the French and the Dutch government for co-organizing this event. I'm very happy to join you here today. I always feel like opening remarks are quite daunting because you kind of have to talk about why we're gathering here. And talk about the challenges and complexity of the issues, while at the same time not really going into so much detail, because really we have the true experts here, as well as in the second panel. So what I'm going to try and do is to provide a little bit of a sense of why we at the UN and also in DPKO and DFS, why we think it's very important to hold an event like this today, and how it's absolutely helpful for us as well. So this event is actually very timely. It's been about a month since the high-level meeting on action for peacekeeping, and we're moving towards sort of implementation of the shared commitments that were made in that declaration. I actually think that most of you are familiar with Action for Peacekeeping, but just a very brief word in terms of what it is. So this is, as many of you know, the Secretary General's initiative that was launched in March of this year. And it's an effort to try to revitalize our collective political commitment to peacekeeping. It strongly emphasizes that peacekeeping success depends on all partners to play their role, notably the Security Council, the troop and police contributing countries, and of course the Secretariat, regional organizations, host government, et cetera, et cetera. This Action for Peacekeeping, or A4P, it also came out of a strong recognition that peace operations today are operating in increasingly complex and high-risk environments. In such environments, protection tasks are very challenging due to the rising number of threats to peacekeepers, the prevalence of military and security-driven approaches, it was already mentioned, and the constraining of missions' political space by a whole wide range of factors. So we are here today to consider approaches to protect civilians in two related contexts. The first one is where engagement with non-state actors is required, and the second is where we are confronted by violent extremist groups employing terrorist acts. These two dimensions represent key challenges for contemporary peace operations. So this is not necessarily something that's brand new. In fact, we have been thinking about this internally within the UN and have actually launched a couple of projects. So on the first issue, in 2016, we began a project to examine and strengthen how our missions engage non-state armed groups. This is actually a collaborative effort between DPKO and DPA. We're undertaking a research project on approaches to engage with non-state armed groups in both mission and non-mission settings. So this also builds on the experience of humanitarian and human rights actors. So far, we have developed some case studies, and we've also held some workshops. This is also to try to encourage peace operations in Africa and also in the broader Middle East to share lessons and best practices on engaging with non-state armed groups. Actually, my colleague Naomi Miyashita has been leading the project on the DBKO side, and she will be delving into much more detail on this issue in the first session. For the second issue, last year we initiated a project on adapting peace operations to complex conflict environments. These complex environments such as in Mali or in Somalia. The project examines adaptations related to civilian capacities of peace operations in these very complex environments. This is in complement to the already significant amount of attention that we have dedicated to adapting uniform capabilities to these environments. The project focuses on three areas. One is adapting the mission's political roles. The second is stabilization, state building, and governance efforts. And then finally, also on field support modalities as they relate to mandate implementation. So this project has highlighted that threats to civilians really differ in nature in these types of environments. It also finds that focus on civilian aspects of protection is very important, as is the need to reinforce the conduct of security forces and institutions to help build legitimacy and prevent grievances from further being fueled. The project has also highlighted the risks for UN peace operations operating in parallel with military counterterrorism operations. So the sessions later today will delve much more. Again, I'm not going to go into all the complexities that these projects have been identifying, but the two sessions today will delve into much more depth on the challenges that these contexts pose. I'd like to say just a few words also on how today's events contributes to furthering our policy work. So within DBKO and DFS, we are, of course, continuously refining our effort to provide policy and guidance on protection issues. So we have long recognized that effective protection requires planning and preparation. This begins at headquarters with proper mission design. It continues with our troop and police contributing countries in pre-deployment training. And it also takes place on the ground through mission-specific strategies to protect civilians. This requires a whole-of-mission approach with joint action by civilians, military, police, and under clear guidance from strong leadership to make an effective impact on the ground. All of these actions, going from planning to preparation and action on the ground, they all must be aligned within the context in which these peace operations are operating, and the specific threats that these contexts provide. This threats to civilians as well as threats to forces. This includes being prepared to use the range of tools available to the mission and address the threats from non-state armed groups or asymmetric and indiscriminate attacks. So effective protection requires strong conflict analysis, mission-wide strategies that are aligned to key political objectives, working in partnership with other actors and engagement with the widest array of stakeholders in pursuit of these objectives, including non-state and prescribed armed groups. All of this sounds fantastic in theory, but it also shows how complex it is. I mean, engaging with non-state armed groups and operating in complex environments is something that's extremely challenging, but it's also part of this organism and very delicate as well as complex processes that missions have to operate in. Approaches in the challenging environments that we are discussing today really require better leveraging our civilian capacity to engage, especially to engage further with local communities to understand their perceptions and how they perceive threats. So we must be better at reaching out to other actors outside of the UN realm, particularly in situations where the force has reduced presence or limited access, and where prevention gains further prominence as key to protection. I would also like to mention very briefly how we can learn from practices in the specialized protection mandates. This would include the mandates on conflict-related sexual violence and children and armed conflict. So our senior women's protection advisors and missions, as well as child protection officers in our peace operations, they often engage with non-state armed groups in the issues around protection, and they in turn contribute to informing broader mission engagement with those armed groups. For example, in Mali, the signing of the unilateral communique on preventing and responding to conflict-related sexual violence by the armed group Coordination des Mouvements de l'Azawad in 2017 resulted from a well-planned, patient, and coordinated engagement by our senior women's protection advisor. So with all of the above in mind, we are currently reviewing the DBKO and DFS policy on protection of civilians in UN peacekeeping, in close consultations with our senior protection advisors on the ground, as well as with other key protection actors that would include civilian, military, and police actors. We're looking at ways to address emerging policy issues that are currently not reflected in our policy. So this would include POC in asymmetric warfare and complex security environments that we've been talking about, and how this translates into tailored context-specific protection approaches and activities. So as you can see, today's event is extremely timely from our perspective, and we really look forward to learning from the discussions. I've been really impressed with the truly impressive panel of speakers for the 2 sessions that you have managed to convene today. We're really looking forward to having this opportunity to hear from a very wide variety of perspectives on these complex issues. And this is going to be absolutely helpful for furthering our own work as well. And I wish everybody a very fruitful discussion in the day. Thank you.
Thank you very much for these welcoming remarks and the opening remarks. I'm going to dispense with most of my talking points. No offense, Archie, wherever he is. I think we got an idea why we're here. We have an idea what is being done to address some of the challenges. I like what General Leon said. These non-state armed groups, not only are they competing for the hearts and the minds of this population, but guess what? For their pockets as well. I like the word peace operators and all the expectations that are placed upon them. And I'm very happy to hear the word politics and peace coming back because we tend to think about the instruments and how to perfect the instrument as if it's going to enhance our relevance by perfecting it. And being a former SRSG heading a peace operation that had only protection of civilian in its mandate, I wish I had benefited from these remarks, and I'm sure I'm going to learn some more. So without further ado, I'm going to get my remarks out of the way and start our discussions. As you will see from the program, we have about an hour and 45 minutes. We have encouraged our speakers to stick to the time limit that was assigned to them, with the exception of our first speaker, Mr. Ralph Mamiya, who is the author of the first policy report we're going to discuss this morning. Ralph is a non-resident advisor at IPI and a former POC leader at UN DPKO DFS. We have given him 10 minutes to walk us through some of the interesting reflection, observation, particularly recommendation. He will be followed by the 4 other speakers you see on my right and left. We have asked them not to exceed 7 minutes. We have warned them that if they do, they will see me engage into an epileptic dance, and it's not a pretty sight. So I'm sure they will cooperate. So to my right, after Mr. Mamiya, is Ms. Naomi Miyashita. She is the policy planning team leader in the Division of Policy Evaluation and Training, DPET, in the United Nations DPKO, who has been one of the leaders and, in fact, pioneers of the UN's non-state armed groups project. We then will hear from Ms. Agnes Coutu, Peacekeeping and Protection Advisor at the International Committee of the Red Cross, who has served, as you've seen from her bio, in numerous countries, including Indonesia, DRC, Liberia, South Sudan, and so on. To her left, to her immediate left, is Mr. Michael Sample, Dr. Michael Sample, I should hasten to correct, a practitioner. Not many doctors are practitioners, but he is. Practitioner, chair, and professor, Senator George Mitchell Institute for Global Peace, Security and Justice, Queen's University at Belfast, with substantial experience in conflict resolution, dialogue, and peacemaking, particularly in South Africa and in the Middle East, but with significant expertise on Afghanistan and the Taliban movement. To his left and to my extreme left, last but not least, Mr. Adam Day, head of programs, Center for Policy Research, United Nations University, who has worked on peace operations, political engagement in conflict setting, mediation and protection, and has extensive experience on the DRC. So there you are. We have assembled for you academicians, researchers, practitioners. So it's going to be a field morning for all of us. It's a treat. So without further ado, I will pass on the floor to Ralph, who has courageously came back, even though he lost his voice. So he's going to toil on, and I will be his loudspeaker if necessary after he finishes. Ralph, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Yusuf. Thank you to General Leon, Admiral Vandenberg, and to this fantastic panel. I hope my voice does last through the 10 minutes. If not, I may finish my presentation with a dance. And I think, following the opening speakers is actually daunting for me as well. And this paper very much, drawing on what Sir Vandenberg said, does not try to give us a faster horse. I think it really tries to look at all the tools that peacekeeping has, particularly those around political engagement. I think one of the first points I do want to make around what this paper is about is defining engagement. There were many colleagues particularly in peacekeeping missions I spoke with, who when I asked them about engaging armed groups, their minds immediately went to the military. And for them, engagement meant military operations. And I agree definitely, where we have troops, there is a role for the military to play, and often a very important role. At the same time, I want to be clear that I really am focusing on engaging armed groups in terms of political dialogue. And I'll get into the different capacities peacekeeping missions and peace operations in general can bring to this. I also think it's important to unpack a little bit what we mean by non-state armed groups. Those of us who spend enough time working in peace operations and in conflict zones, we learn to rattle off the acronyms of armed groups. The M23, the FRPI, the UPC, the ADF. Having this litany of names, I think, gives us a sense of control over what is often a very ambiguous, very difficult to discern set of actors. And I think I really try to begin this paper with a warning to be careful when considering these acronyms, because the reality, and we see this in numerous peace operations contexts, is that these are groups made up of individuals. They're made up of, and there's underlying those individuals are relationships and networks. And they fragment, they realign, they refragment. Name almost any peace operation that's been there for more than a few years, and you can see that phenomenon. So it really is a warning to question our assumptions. Assumptions even regarding the relationship between a, quote, non-state armed group and the state. Because in many of these conflicts, there are relationships between these groups. Some non-state armed groups are not wholly opposed to the state. They often seek some modicum of state power, and state actors will often utilize armed groups for their own ends. There's also very complex relationships between non-state armed groups and communities. Non-state armed groups are often portrayed as predatory, as menacing, as something as outside of their communities, and obviously many of them can accurately be described in that way. At the same time, There are often complex relationships between those groups and the communities in which, that they predate upon. Many of them began as self-defense militias. Many of them, they remain having familial ties, blood ties to some of these communities. So, it's important not to paint non-state armed groups with a black and white brush. The main argument in this paper is that not only is engaging non-state armed groups important for the protection of civilians, and that's a point that I hope is not too controversial, given the work of organizations like the International Committee of the Red Cross, who have really established reputations built upon that. But also that the protection of civilians mandate can assist missions in what is really a very challenging task when they are engaging non-state armed groups. Yusuf, in his excellent introduction, mentioned some of those dilemmas, that this is really politically a very challenging thing. It's very easy for us to sit here and say missions should do more to engage these groups politically, but if you are an SRSG or a political affairs officer, that brings with it significant risks. You're working in a context in which you're very dependent on the host government. The host government often will not like it when you engage these groups. Engaging these groups can be dangerous from a staff safety and security perspective. And there is always the risk that your engagement with them creates the appearance of legitimacy. And this is not formal legitimacy, it's not legal legitimacy, but just as humanitarians are concerned about the perception of their neutrality, peace operations must be concerned about the perceptions of what kind of endorsement we're providing to a group. And that's, of course, not to say that we shouldn't engage. We absolutely should. But it is a call to be aware of the risks. The idea that, hopefully that idea that engaging non-state armed groups is important for protection is not controversial. It's often less clear, though, how the protection of civilians mandate can support engaging armed groups. Humanitarians and mediators have been doing this for a long time. And a lot of the lessons, when I did this paper, a lot of my time was spent looking at their lessons. And one of the first things that strikes you is that a lot of the ways in which they overcome the challenges inherent to engaging armed groups are very difficult for peace operations to replicate. Humanitarians, of course, protect their neutrality. They operate with strict impartiality. And like mediators, they also tend to have a very low profile. They tend to be small organizations that can act nimbly, they can act with agility. That's something that's much more difficult for peace operations to do. Peace operations, almost, certainly the ones I looked at, and almost across the board, have very clear mandates to support host governments. And that's supporting them through capacity building, it's supporting them to extend their own state authority. And it's a mandate that means, anyone who reads that, and I think non-state armed groups are aware of what our missions are mandated to do. When the cards are on the table, the peace operation will side with the government. I think there's no two ways about that in most of these contexts. And so that raised the initial conundrum for entities like peace operations that have an inherent degree of non-neutrality. I mean, they have impartiality and they execute their mandates impartially. But when you, at the end of the day, will side with the host government, how do you credibly engage with non-state armed groups? And this is where I found the protection of civilians mandate to be an important tool for missions. The mandate can clarify the purpose. It can provide an important moral argument when convincing governments of the need for engagement. One example of this was MONUSCO's child protection team. They are currently engaging with a number of armed groups to demobilize children. This was not a very popular move with the government of DRC when it was announced. And they've worked and found solutions, creative political solutions, to gain the government's consent to engage in these dialogues. But that does require political creativity. There are also key capacities that peace operations bring. I mentioned very briefly the military and targeted military operations, such as in Central African Republic, were very important in facilitating and moving forward dialogue there. Also, programmatic funding, whether that's through DDR, through community violence reduction, or through stabilization programs, was raised a number of times in many of the successful cases of engagement as a key tool for missions to have when engaging armed groups. It's something tangible that can be offered. Impartial public reporting was also a very important tool. We can see this in UNAMA through their human rights reporting. By calling out both international forces, the government, as well as the Taliban on human rights violations and abuses, they're really able to establish the credibility and the impartiality of the mission. And if used strategically, and ECHO sort of emphasized the importance of strategy and coordination in peace operations, there were some very important examples of success there. And ultimately, non-state armed groups are pragmatic actors. I think this was one of the things that really struck me. Despite mandates to support governments or even target armed groups, peace operations can establish themselves as credible actors. And peace operations must be similarly pragmatic when confronting new contexts. They must devote resources to analysis and understanding the people and the groups they're dealing with. They must have political acumen as well as the political courage to engage with armed groups even where this appears to be an unpopular move. So thank you. Hopefully that's within time.
Thank you very much. I hesitated to interrupt you because such a rich number of points that you have made. I just marked 3, just in case at the end we don't have the time to summarize, so I learned to sneak in my own thoughts of what the takeaway should be. Number 1 is that we must question or revisit the powerful assumptions underlying or informing our understanding of what engagement means and what the complex relationship that ought to exist between these armed groups, the states, and the communities in which they are embedded. 2, we must understand the risks, both political and otherwise, in order to be able to navigate. We must also draw lessons from other non-peacekeeping entities, particularly the humanitarian work, in order to learn how they manage these groups. And final point is that the POC, interestingly enough, provides a way to navigate all these conundrums and to reconcile what seems to be contradictory mandates. And he shared some pragmatic ways this can be done, and the report is really rich with those pragmatic ways. I will return towards the end of the discussion when I give the panel the floor. Where is peace in all of this? How can we eke out a little space for the word peace before the word operations? Without further ado, I would like now to give the floor to, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Youssef, and thank you to France and the Netherlands for organizing this event. I'm really happy also, oh, sorry. Is that better? like Ralph, I actually also have a cold, and I may have to break out into dance as well if I don't manage to finish.
Thank you for the warning.
Yeah, and I'm also really happy for the opportunity to talk about something that's not action for peacekeeping for once. That's really been the bread and butter for me the past few months. So ACO's talked a little bit about the project, the non-state armed group project that we're conducting together with the Department of Political Affairs. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that, and I'm going to draw out in particular 3 myths, and I want to debunk these myths that we've come across in the process of doing this project, and offer some alternatives and some ideas on how we can take forward this issue of engagement with non-state armed groups. And so, first of all, the project, why we decided to establish this project. It was very clear to us that, of course, non-state armed groups are a massive fixture of all the conflicts where we're operating, but we're also throwing so many different things at them that things can get very confusing, not only for conflict actors, but also for us as peacekeepers and as peace operators, as implementers in the field. So if you're a rebel commander in the Congo, for example, you can have a full day of meetings with all the different components of MONUSCO, with a child protection advisor who would want you to sign an action plan to stop violations, with an expert panel from a sanctions regime that may say that you're going to get listed for your connections with organized crime and your illicit trade in minerals. A military commander may say, we're going to start neutralizing you in 2 weeks when we manage to finish our planning of our operations. A DDR officer may be offering you to join a community violence reduction program. So there's a diversity of ways in which our missions engage with and interact with armed groups, and we felt that it might be useful to help our peace operations, not only peacekeeping but also SPMs, to think through how do you devise strategies that are coherent, that can come together, and that make sense. And here I think, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to throw in action for peacekeeping, but this is really relevant for A4P. And when we look at not only the provisions and the commitments on protection, which call for tailored and specific strategies that rely not only on military but also on civilian approaches to enhance protection. When you look at the other commitments under politics, you will see that there's a very strong call for a sequencing and a prioritization and a thinking of a more strategic approach to how to implement mandates and how to bring peace. So I think there's a very clear, relevance there. So maybe moving on very, very quickly to the 3 myths. First of all, the thing that we've come across is, myth number 1, engaging with non-state armed groups is a zero-sum game. It's not. And, it's not either or. It's not either, you address that, you basically organize kinetic military operations against them to neutralize them, or you engage and talk to them. In many places where there are counterterrorism operations ongoing, in fact, UN peace operations do have quiet channels of communication with non-state armed groups. And it's important to maintain those channels of communication. I think the trick is really to think about how to use the tools at our disposal, all of the range of incentives and disincentives. And when I talked about those conversations that the MONUSCO, that the rebel commander in Congo would be having, those represent, a spectrum of tools that we have. It's about how we organize ourselves and how we ensure that we have clarity in the objectives we are seeking to achieve vis-a-vis a non-state armed group and vis-a-vis a conflict situation, and that we're consistent and that we're considered in how we apply a strategy to achieve those goals. And I think Ralph talked about the role of human rights in Afghanistan, for example. We need to look at the totality of actors, not only focusing on what we do about this or that armed group. and speaking, human rights reporting in Afghanistan has managed to expand and enhance the credibility and the political space that the mission has to achieve its goals. So the takeaway really is that we have to get smarter about what we want to achieve in our interactions with non-state armed groups and to develop strategies in that regard. The second myth that we came across is that talking to non-state armed groups is necessarily confers legitimacy to them. And Ralph touched a little bit upon this. This is a major barrier to engagement. This fear that speaking to armed groups will either elevate their standing or get us into trouble with governments. And yes, there are definitely risks, but we can get also smarter about how you manage those risks. And we can take a leaf out of the experience of humanitarian actors as well in this regard. There are many different ways you can think about it. You can determine what the parameters for engagement are up front. There are ways in which you can engage in private. There are ways in which you can choose whether you're engaging at a high political level, therefore attributing more profile, or whether you actually engage at an informal and more working level in a mission. How you involve host governments, how you consult them, how you inform them of engagement is also important. So it's really about risk mitigation. It's not about a blanket, no, we can't do that because we'll get into trouble. The third myth is that non-state armed groups are monolithic. They are not, and it's not only about kind of fixating on acronyms. It's also about understanding that when we apply broader labels such as terrorist group or extremist group and so on, we're actually completely reducing the identity of that group and failing to realize that many groups, as we can see across groups in the Sahel and in Syria, that when you look at the composition of those groups, the foot soldiers are not men and women who espouse a transnational ideology necessarily. They've really joined that armed group for meat and potato, bread and butter issues. And therefore, if you by applying this label and this lens of terrorist or extremist, and with the policy prescriptions that follow from that label, you are limiting your ability to change behavior or to resolve the threats that you believe that armed group is posing. So really here then the takeaway is that we must get better understanding armed groups, and we must have a much more nuanced and balanced and non-politicized view of what armed groups are as a UN, I think. And so finally, I was at the risk of having Yusuf break into a dance here. Three takeaways broadly for this project in terms of where we would like to go with this. And what we'd like to explore. One, I've mentioned the analysis piece. We would like to be able to help our missions analyze and understand armed groups better. Second, there's a strong linkage between the non-state armed groups and the broader political strategy that missions need to be thinking of, and we hope to be able to strengthen our thinking on that. And then third is this issue of taking risks. We would like to help our missions be able to take more calculated, to approach risk-taking with awareness of all the considerations and in a more considered way, but not to fear the taking of risks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Naomi. You've facilitated my task immensely. I don't have to share with you what I think, my takeaways. She did it beautifully. It's a good complement to the first part. Not only we need to revisit and question our assumptions, we have to also address and debunk some of the themes. And she mentioned 3 or 4 of them. In order to make sure how we're going to do our work smarter. I like particularly the last one, which is one of the biggest complications when you want to engage, because it makes you forget, why am I engaging? And we just get stuck on the how and the what. And the last one is about, if you label them as a terrorist or extremist with the baggage of the policy prescriptions, then you've set up yourself for yet an added, it doesn't mean that they are innocent, but nonetheless, you've added additional complication to carrying out your mandate. Now, without further ado, give the floor to Ms. Kutu.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to IPI to have invited a humanitarian voice to this panel to discuss about what best practices can UN peace operations learn from humanitarian workers, from mediators. And as Ralph highlighted in his paper, it's very difficult for UN peace missions to replicate those humanitarian strategies to engage with non-state armed groups due to the very nature of UN peace missions, which are internationally mandated by a political organ, which is the Security Council. So, but in your paper, Ralph, you listed 4 main factors that were identified by humanitarians and by mediators that could be of use to UN peace missions. And I just want to reflect around those. So it's about the clear purpose of engagement, the prioritization of resources, impartiality, openness to engage with all groups, and that's also to build on what Naomi just said, and the freedom to choose to engage or not, or to withdraw from this engagement. So I will share my ICRC lens on all of those issues. So on the clear purpose and transparent purpose of engagement, it's clear that in the business of dealing with those political entrepreneurs, to quote Alex Deval in your paper, and non-state armed groups, and we agree that these terminologies cover a vast array of categories, from the cattle herders in South Sudan to Hezbollah in Lebanon. So one has to be predictable and to be consistent between one's saying and one's actions, and be transparent on the why we engage. And to have been there myself in South Sudan and DRC, I can testify that it has always proven a good choice to tell right from the beginning, right from the first meeting with commanders, why we are here and what we want to discuss, and including hard discussions. So for ICRC and for other humanitarian organizations, our purposes are very clear. The first one is security of our staff, of our operations, and safe access to people in need of humanitarian assistance. But then we have also a mandate, which is very unique to ICRC, to monitor conduct of hostilities, to monitor behaviors of all parties to armed conflict, including non-state armed groups. So that means we need to bring on the table problematic behaviors and provide recommendations on how they could improve in a very practical way, but also in a very forward-looking way. We are not into the business of accountability and things, and especially we do that confidentially, bilaterally, behind closed doors. We don't do naming and shaming. We don't publicize our reports, which offers us, in complementarity with other actors, a safe space to engage and to sustain this engagement and to secure our humanitarian operation. And another objective is to also raise the awareness and educate on humanitarian law, on the laws of war, also on human rights and on basic principles of humanity. This is a clear mission of ICRC. And what is also can be of interest to them, to the non-state armed groups, we offer our services to visit their detainees. This is also a very specific mission of ICRC, and I was interested to read in your paper the example that you quote about MINUSMA, who managed to build relationship with some non-state armed groups due to identification of detainees. So this is something that ICRC will use to network with armed groups. So we should never shy away to bring those matters that are not going to please our interlocutors in the first encountering, because otherwise we lose credibility and we raise suspicion, and it's never good. In terms of the prioritization of resources, we are also starting ICRC collaborating with more academics, with anthropologists, with sociologists to really facilitate our understanding of the anatomy of those armed groups and to find entry points. But we have also in the house and a wide range of expertise that are of direct interest to non-state armed groups. We have physiotherapists who can provide prostheses for wounded combatants, for instance. We have war surgeons who can train paramedics on how to deal with post-trauma care on improvised explosive device. We have military experts. We have legal experts, and in the Philippines there are many armed groups who love engaging with us on humanitarian law and the laws of war, and we have very sophisticated discussions on that. So we have different entry points that can be hooks also for armed groups to be interested in what we have to propose, but at the condition that we can enter into a meaningful and honest dialogue on also their obligations and their responsibilities. So the best entry point is not necessarily a delegate, I mean a generalist delegate, like I used to be asking to visit their detainees. It can be a doctor who can talk about health needs in the population they have under their control, and at the same time ask to see the detainees and check on their health, for instance. So that's practical ways for us to engage. Regarding the second factor of impartiality, there is often a confusion about the meaning of neutrality and impartiality, and they have specific meanings in humanitarian terms, obviously. So neutrality for an organization like ICRC means not taking sides, as simple as that. So to do our humanitarian work and effectively and safely, we must be dissociated from any kind of political agendas. This is very critical to us. It's a question of, I mean, it's life-saving. And neutrality in that sense for us is not an end in itself. It's really a tool for accessing populations. And the fact that we are not here to solve a conflict, we are not here to participate to let's say get involved into the political reasons for this conflict. Our main aim is to reduce the human cost of it. So that's the premises, let's say, of the discussion. And impartiality in humanitarian terms means simply means, well, 1 minute, that would be hard, that we must calibrate our response in proportion to humanitarian needs. That's what it means. So as such, we do not endorse terrorism labels issued by political entities or whoever makes those designations, because they have no legal value first, and it's also antagonizing, it's subjective, and someone's terrorist is someone else freedom fighters or someone else protector. So for us, it has no value. So I will move quickly to the two other factors because I have only a few minutes left. The third one, openness to engage with all groups. A few years back, our Director General said that we were in a newspaper that we wanted to have ISIS at our table. Yeah, well, ideally, yes, we want to engage with everyone. Of course, it should not be too risky for our staff. But this engagement is not supposed to confer any kind of political legitimacy. Of course, it's easier said than done. And even with an organization like ICRC, we need to be vigilant of the perceptions and not to be instrumentalized and manipulated by armed groups to give them a specific posture, if behind it's served as a cover for even perpetuation of violations. And that's where, and that's the last factors where we need to decide to disengage. But it comes with risk also not to engage with those groups. And more recently, we actually lost a delegate in Taiz in Yemen, and we lost recently also humanitarian colleagues, ICRC colleagues in Nigeria. I mean, the variety of armed groups we are engaging with, the fact that, for instance, in South Sudan, we have listed more than 50, for instance, different levels of armed groups. That pose significant logistical challenge, political challenge, security challenge, obviously, but also legal ones, because armed groups, as they are not states, they don't have the right to conduct hostilities. So they are bound by the laws of war, but at the same time, they cannot be party to the laws of war. So that creates also an imbalance that we need to take into consideration. Thank you.
Thank you. Clearly very helpful to know about this specific ICRC-specific modus operandi and objective of engagement. I think the first one is you never get a second chance to make a first good impression. So be upfront from why you're there. It's particularly if your aim is to create, sustain a space for your work. Second, you have heard of all the special ways they create that particular space, from educating them to actually providing services. A lot to learn. I think the point that stayed with me most is understand the anatomy of these armed groups, what motivates them. Because the tendency is to dehumanize in order to justify the package of measures that we have prepared. And therefore, there is no space for engagement. Next on my list is our good friend, the doctor, and I want to find his name so I don't massacre it. Dr. Michael Semple. Dr. Semple, you have the floor, sir.
Thanks a lot. Delighted to be here. I was going to mention at the end, but I'll mention at the start. You can call me the professor, but not the doctor.
Okay.
I am a professor. I genuinely am pleased to be part of the conversation here today because, I spend a lot of my time grappling with the issues of engagement with non-state armed actors and from the perspective of peace and politics. And so I'm happy to be able to jump to the issue of where does POC fit into this? Is there a route POC engagement, peace and politics, which I think exercises you as well, Yusuf. In going through the papers, the thing that jumped at me and that I would encourage everybody to reopen, reread, and take seriously is the Afghanistan case study on POC via raising the issue of civilian casualties. I think it's absolutely appropriate that this has been highlighted in the report, and I think that if somebody is writing up a history of the Afghan conflict, say 10 or 15 years from now, and they have got a sort of a slightly better perspective than those of us sitting today, I think it's eminently possible that when going through all the dreadful things that have happened, one positive opportunity and positive contribution of international actors working in Afghanistan will be the engagement that was brought up in this case study. And I think it's a fascinating example because genuinely the UN mission has helped to capture the narrative and affect the conduct of war. And that's amazing to be able to do that. And I say this as someone who spends his time, my research is indeed on the Taliban and trying to document the political culture of the movement as a way into understanding what's happening. And I believe that my research confirms these two things. Both narrative and practice have been changed. The narrative in that now all actors in the conflict are obliged to say and justify what they're doing vis-a-vis civilian casualties. And I guess I very importantly pointed out, not just the armed groups, the state actors as well. And the Taliban certainly have modified practices in terms of the instructions which are passed down to fighters, the structures which exist inside the movement, and actually how commanders conduct operations. It's not perfect. That they sometimes you get cover up rather than improvement, but the Taliban movement now operates a national commission for avoidance of civilian casualties, with a chief, delegations that participate in regular humanitarian dialogues, and also representatives who operate in the field, who actually interact with the fighters of the movement. So it's not actually UN personnel who are directly contacting commanders. It's Taliban officials of the Commission on Avoiding Civilian Casualties. So to get an example of how this plays out, the Taliban did what they could to disrupt last week's parliamentary elections. They made it absolutely clear that they were warning civilians, in very regrettable ways, that that we have told you not to participate. If you do, we're not answerable for the consequences. But in the instructions to the commanders, it was avoid attacks on places where civilians are congregated. So you can't blow up rallies, were the instructions. Now, this does not go to immediate compliance with IHL. There's still a job for ICRC to do. There are major differences between the way the Taliban choose to interpret civilian and IHL interpretations. But anyway, I think that the basic point that I really want to flag up is that this is something that it has been possible to do. One of the there are some reasons why it has been possible. Partly there has been an alignment between what the Taliban have wanted to do and what the international actors have been interested in doing. It has suited the Taliban to do this. It has been it has fitted in with their agenda for remodeling their organization, as they've picked themselves up after the collapse in 2001. And this is, of course, where you immediately encounter issues of legitimacy. It's also been possible, and I think this is a critical thing here, because the actors involved have been able to access a safe place to talk. Again, I hope this is one of the points that you will remember. As somebody who has been looking for routes from engagement to peace and politics, often the absence of safe place or difficulty of accessing it has been a significant obstacle. So we've had in a sense the opportunity provided by the establishment of a Taliban political mission inside Qatar helped in the provision of a safe space to talk for what essentially were POC and humanitarian dialogues. And of course, in this issue of the interaction between peace and politics and humanitarian, that the work of their Taliban political mission was essentially blocked for quite a few years. And so we did find an example where the discussion around POC essentially gave them a role. They coordinated this dialogue at a time when they were blocked from doing the politics which they had anticipated. Now, just on some of the other lessons from the experience, everybody else has referred to legitimacy. They've referred to they've raised the issue of the worry that international engagement with the non-state groups could be instrumentalized for them to seek legitimacy. Now, on one level, it's sort of inevitable. But there's a way that I would argue that if the Taliban have used avoidance of civilian casualties as a way of cultivating, legitimacy, it's probably not a negative development. That we have helped to shape their path in the pursuit of legitimacy, but it's still a consideration. However, also we should be aware that the weak and often discredited states can try to instrumentalize their international partners and restrict access to those groups who may have more influence over and relevance to the population than they themselves, as a way of trying to grasp some legitimacy which they have lost in the front of their population. So yes, legitimacy is important, but we've got to be clever about it. Now, I mean, I think that the Afghanistan case does show that there are potential routes from POC towards questions around peace and politics. I think I had a strong sense of this in earlier stages of the UN mission when I was working there, where there was a time pre 9/11 where some POC work, humanitarian engagement was all that was sanctioned, and that the political side of the UN was extremely hampered. I certainly wore a humanitarian hat in those days, and the DPA colleagues every now and then would come in and say, "It's very good that you people are humanitarian at the moment," was the way they put it. And I think that the work that was done at that stage provided a useful foundation for even the Bonn process itself, when suddenly, in a sense, there was everything was turned upside down. Those who had been proto-state actors became non-state actors. Those who'd been sort of proto-non-state actors became state actors. But the fact that there had been a UN engagement with all sides of the conflict was helpful in putting together a political mission and an attempted peace process.
Thank you so much. Much appreciated. You brought the two P's together, peace and politics. If one of the primary aims is to move people from violence to politics, clearly that should be kept in mind constantly, whether it's through POC or through creating spaces, and be ready to create those spaces for dialogue when alignments of the agenda happens. So that's very helpful to bring us to what is the ultimate aim of peace operation, and how the means should be used to get to that ultimate aim, rather than they becoming an objective in themselves. Last but not least, it's now my pleasure to give the floor to
Adam. Thanks very much. I'll try and speak directly
Adam, I beg your pardon. Where did I invent this? Sorry.
Thanking Michael, moving on to Adam.
Sorry.
I'll try to speak directly from my experience as the senior political advisor to MONUSCO, where I was tasked with developing politically driven strategies for the armed groups, and also the work I did directly with DPKO on the MONUSCO report on non-state armed groups, which has quite a bit of overlap with Ralph's report. And I think the theme I'd like to try to cover is how MONUSCO offers examples for innovation in peacekeeping in this space. So I'll do 4 points. The first one is what the deputy head of MONUSCO called dynamic, constantly evolving strategies. And I think a really important thing in a situation like Eastern Congo is to understand that there isn't an overarching political framework for dealing with armed groups, and that the bulk of the groups in Eastern Congo are dealt with on a fairly ad hoc basis. And even with the bigger groups, the broader political agreements have largely dissolved in terms of political momentum behind them, like the FDLR. And it's an incredibly fluid conflict terrain where fixed, results-based budget, multi-year strategies don't seem to generate a lot of leverage, and it tends to overlook opportunities that may arise in the moment. So the challenge there is to develop a strategy that is capable of changing and that is iterative, but that also gives direction to the mission. I think an example is one that Ralph put in his report, which is the FRPI. And this is a group in Ituri that we've had constant engagement with over the last 20 years, multiple uses of force, arresting the head, I think several times, and imprisoning him, the state did. And where if you tried to capture all of that in terms of a narrative or a discussion of a strategy, it just wouldn't fit. And what was really important for the mission at the time was to have its finger on the pulse and be ready to respond when an opportunity arose. and develop a strategy out of that opportunity. And I think Ralph's short box on that is a good example of building a cross-cutting strategy by having your finger on the pulse. Which leads actually to the second point, which is another quote, which is intelligence-driven design. In my interviews with MONUSCO and other actors in Eastern Congo, human intelligence capacity was cited as the major enabler for engagement with armed groups. I'm looking forward to this afternoon's discussion of Mali, where that intelligence gathering capacity was really piloted. But I think during my time in MONUSCO, there was a real push to build the human intelligence capacity of the mission, a dedicated set of resources in Beni, which is where there was a need for greater analysis. And it was really modeled on Mali. And it was a good example, I think, of taking innovation from one setting and bringing it into another. And the key challenge, I think, in this setting is if you build this intelligence gathering capacity, this analytic capacity to understand better what colleagues here have called the anatomy of the armed groups, you then have to have that guide what your activities are and your engagement. And one of the big challenges, I think, is as missions become more inclined to offensive use of force, it becomes harder to constrain or guide those military activities with some of that civilian intelligence and analysis. And I think that is one of the real conundrums that arises in a situation like MONUSCO. Which brings me to the third point, the risk of neutralization, which is the word used to describe the mandate of MONUSCO. And I remember talking to someone who will remain nameless in MONUSCO who said, how can I be expected to talk to an armed group or ask him to come to the table when we are bombing his positions in the Kivus? And I think it really points to the dilemmas that arise when you are using force and trying to do political engagement. There are examples where use of force can help bring actors to the table, but it does create very significant dilemmas when it comes to issues of impartiality. And if you look at some of the surveys that are done on the population of Eastern Congo, how they view MONUSCO, I think you see some real impact in how the neutralization mandate has played out. And I think what it also raises a risk of is that you think of armed groups in terms of numbers. I remember sitting with the Minister of Foreign Affairs in 2016, and he showed us a list and said, if you can get this armed group down below this number, this armed group down below that number, then you can leave. And it's very hard when you have a numerical approach to these groups to really understand the qualitative end state that we're aiming for. And I think MONUSCO did develop much more qualitative ways of understanding what the conditions of success could be with armed groups, but it is a challenge when you're using force. The fourth point is the crime-conflict nexus. Armed groups, as has been pointed out, are not one thing. The example of the Allied Democratic Forces in the Beni area, they have links into the political elite in Beni. They're active members of the timber trafficking. They often work with individual state members in this. They are occasionally aligned with political opposition actors. They're really part of the socioeconomic fabric of North Kivu. And I think the reference to Alex de Waal's excellent book on the real politics of the Horn of Africa, where he develops this idea of the political marketplace, is actually something that MONUSCO was looking to develop. And during my time there, they actually founded something called the Criminal Networks Task Force, which drew out of the mandate of MONUSCO to consider how criminal networks could influence or support even the group of the armed groups. And one of the things that came out of that was a multi-prong approach to these armed groups. So an example would be the FDLR using illicit charcoal networks into Goma. The mission would do military activities against the FDLR to disrupt those activities, justice-driven initiatives to help bring those actors who are responsible, including state actors, to justice, and 3, stabilization funds being used to replace the charcoal that was being disrupted. And I think when you start thinking about the socioeconomic existence of these groups, it gives you many more kind of points of reference to engage with them in different levels. And so those are really the 4 points I wanted to raise. I want to end with a quote by Jean-Marie Gaheno in my first meeting where I was a minor note taker. He said, peacekeeping is about applying principles to complexity. And I think that this is essentially what we're trying to do in POC. And I was struck looking around the room at how many people have been doing this for a long time. I remember sitting in Juba with Ralph, talking about the various conflict dynamics there in 2010. I see colleagues from MONUSCO who spend every waking day thinking about the anatomy of various conflict settings in Eastern Congo. I see Chris O'Donnell, who has a very long list of places where he's been trying to do DDR for the last decade. And I think I even saw Rana Taha, who I remember sitting with in El Fasher in 2007, talking about how to deal with armed groups in UNIMID. And the point of this is that there's an enormous amount of innovation. Peacekeeping is an incredibly flexible tool. And I think what I like about this approach is we start drawing the lessons from different experiences into the policies around protection. And I think that's one of the real benefits of Ralph's approach, is trying to tap into that expertise and experience. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for these very clear examples of innovation. And I particularly took note of the need for greater analysis and the cross-mission learning, even though they are two different contexts. Thank you also for highlighting this web of socioeconomic alliances between networks that complicates the approach. So, ladies and gentlemen, we've heard from researchers, we heard from policymakers, we've heard from practitioners. So you have a rather complex background of how to spell POC differently, how to engage with non-state actors differently. Hopefully, your understanding of the word engagement and your understanding of non-state armed group has changed, particularly if you apply the peace, politics, and the economics lenses on them. And so without further ado, I open the floor. We have a good half an hour or so for exchange. So I'll recognize hands if I see one. And so the microphone goes to the lady over there.
Thank you. My name is Siobhan O'Neill, and I'm from UN University. I want to thank the panel for some very interesting interjections. And I'd love to pick up this conversation about conferring legitimacy on armed groups through engagement and offer two alternate, possibly provocative perspectives. The first one is on an assumption that we seem to continue to have that I think might be a bit dated, and that is that the UN or member states are the ones that control and bestow legitimacy. To many of the groups operating in new contexts, that may not be the case. Certainly, if there are groups that are trying to capture part of the state or secede from the state, perhaps. But I think we also need to challenge that concept that we are the owners of legitimacy. The second response is about the focus on the risk-reward balance of bestowing legitimacy. We tend to focus on the risk and mitigating that risk, and I think to the detriment of appreciating the opportunity. Quickly, I will just say that many of the times when states or other entities designate groups as terrorist or increasingly violent extremist, it is to signal that they operate outside the bounds of societal norms. It is to tie their hands so they cannot engage with them. This limits the space in which those groups can operate. By engaging them, we help reduce their ghettoization. We expand their worldview. There is research on particular conflicts, Northern Ireland being one of them, and on individual combatants who cite these types of engagements as the reason they leave the battlefield. So I think if we are serious about transforming behavior, but also transforming these groups themselves, we need to think about the benefits of this potential engagement and not just the risks. So I've gone on too long, but I would love if that sparks any comments from the panel to hear your thoughts.
Thank you very much. Any other? So I have Chris here in the middle, and then my good friend Gay all the back there.
My comment's a little bit related to Siobhan concerning the issue of labeling. I think one of the things that we're struggling with right now, Naomi brought it up, that we shouldn't be labeling, and I do agree with that, but I think in most of these, what I've been experiencing is that's not under our control, the labels. In fact, the labels are coming from the Security Council, they're coming from member states. So it's not really something that we have a handle on, and I don't really know how to manage that, but it really does dictate the way in which we will or will not engage with these armed groups. So I think that's something I'd just like the panel to reflect on and maybe see how do we manage that when we don't have control over labels.
Thank you. The back.
Thank you very much. Gay Rosenblum Kumar from Nonviolent Peace Force. I was happy to hear Adam in his opening mention armed and unarmed methods, and Ralph speaking about the value and complementary benefit of political dialogue working side by side with armed peacekeeping. And others noting the complexity and nuanced nature of the subject and how careful analysis and response must be developed. I'd like to make a contribution to share some examples of unarmed civilian protection on the ground and how it works with non-state actors and complements peacekeeping operations where both exist and protects civilians where there is no peacekeeping operation. I'm sure you will all remember this is highlighted in the Hippo report, in which the panel recommended unarmed strategies must be at the forefront of UN efforts to protect civilians. So let me mention quickly that Nonviolent Peace Force is one of 42 organizations now practicing unarmed civilian protection in 24 areas and has done quite a bit with non-state actors. In Sri Lanka, our presence changed the conflict dynamics in several situations in years past that saved lives and protected property. Our teams negotiated with high-level military commanders of the Tamil Tigers to control troop behavior and negotiated on child protection that led to the release and return of kidnapped child soldiers. In Mindanao, where we've had a long-term presence at the request of the government and the MNLF and MILF, our teams stepped in to investigate reports of armed actors' activities that threatened a village and negotiated a halt in the movements of NSAs that stopped the destruction of property and, more importantly, stopped villagers from fleeing and becoming displaced. We went on to train local actors in ceasefire monitoring and set up mechanisms to reporting that goes on to this date. Okay, wrapping up. Let me just mention, in South Sudan, where perhaps we're best known to this audience, NP has 180 protectors in 14 teams. And because of their long-term presence, they have negotiated weapons-free zones, provided regular proactive accompaniment to women, stopping them from sexual assault, and built skills among local communities to negotiate themselves to stop attacks. The key message is here that unarmed civilian protection is an important adjunct to armed peacekeeping and has several features that complement a UN presence. This requires long-term engagement. We do both immediate direct protection against active threats and proactive long-term work. We'd love to have this work more fully recognized in principle within peacekeeping and in cooperation so that civilian protectors could be scaled up in practice. Thank you. I hope this opens a conversation on unarmed approaches and how we can elevate it in our thinking and bringing it further into the conversation. Thanks very much.
Thank you. One more here, and then I'll throw it back to the panels, and then we'll come back to you.
Thank you, Fabien Dubé with MSF. One quick remark, one question. The remark is really about the importance of having member states respecting our space of engagement. I would say both actually for the UN, but for humanitarian organizations. And make sure that, basically these efforts of engagement with non-state actors, some of them, as Agnès, my colleague from the ICRC, mentioned, are indeed listed as terrorist groups, that we have this space just because our business is about saving lives. And so I'm very happy to see that in a number of UN reports, it is very clearly mentioned that member states should not criminalize or dialogue with non-state actors. My question was really for the UN. My impression, is that politically, it's a little bit easier for the UN to engage with non-state groups compared maybe to 20 years ago, where actually for MSF, we would see very clear, red lights given to UN peacekeeping operations or special political missions to engage with certain groups, especially those which were under sanctions. I think it has evolved, but I wanted to ask the panelists if they felt there was today more space politically for the UN to engage with groups. And my question was more the impression we have now in MSF is that very often today the constraints for the UN, either for peacekeeping colleagues or colleagues in SPMs, is really more about the security rules, basically the internal security rules of the UN, making it very difficult for UN colleagues to actually do their peacekeeping or mediation work. I'd be happy to hear them.
Okay, thank you very much. I'd like to throw it back to the panels, and I've asked our good professor, Semple, to perhaps address this issue of legitimacy. Who confers it? Who bestows legitimacy? And also perhaps address whether the focus on risks clouds or distracts us from finding and taking advantage and leveraging opportunities. And perhaps while you're at it, there was by Chris the question, any thoughts about how to manage the labeling of these groups when it is really not the peace operation or those who lead it who have put those categories around certain actors. And then I'd like then the other speakers to address as they see fit the aspect about unarmed civilian protection, and MSF's questions about there seems to be politically an evolution in UN thinking with respect to engaging with unarmed actors, and yet the security requirement seems to discourage that movement towards more open spaces to engaging with non-state armed actors. Professor Semple.
Thank you. Delighted to have this core question. If the premise was that somehow we're all stuck into thinking that the UN confers legitimacy, that would be outdated. And I think what's actually important is to understand how non-state actors devise and roll out their strategies to pursue legitimacy. So it's sort of what they think and do is more important than what we do, and we want to understand that. And my understanding of non-state actors is that they build a strategy of pursuing legitimacy based on both internal legitimacy and external legitimacy. That they seek a legitimacy from their own population, and related to that, they seek one on the international stage, and they are prepared to instrumentalize their dealings with the international actors like the United Nations in pursuit of that. And sometimes it may be that their dealings with the UN are actually about trying to pursue domestic legitimacy, in a sense that they can show the population either what we get from dealing with the UN makes us more legitimate, or the fact that we're taken seriously by and dealing with the UN, that sort of tells the population that, look, we are legitimate. For me, the key is understand the strategy that they're pursuing, and that's exactly then where I get on to agreeing with what you're suggesting. There are opportunities as well as pitfalls. I mean, the classic pitfall, which I think we can see in sort of recent experience in Afghanistan. Now, it was one which was It's in a sense with the political team, and specifically the US political team, encountered, but is a lesson for us all, which was when they were trying to establish the office in Qatar. There were certain guarantees about what symbols wouldn't be used and what claims wouldn't be meant, and lo and behold, on day one, our Taliban brothers run up an Islamic Emirate flag and put a sign outside the door of their mission saying the Islamic Emirate, and months of careful diplomacy end in complete disaster, and what was potentially a very useful opportunity for engagement was squandered, because then of course you get the pushback. So that's an example of where understanding the search for legitimacy, if the team there had understood just how obsessed the Taliban were with that pursuit of legitimacy, they wouldn't have made that mistake. But then on the other side, I've already cited you the example that that this pursuit of legitimacy on the Taliban side became an opportunity through the humanitarian dialogue which has gone on in recent years to direct that pursuit to what is ultimately a positive direction, which is in the reduction of civilian casualties and protection of civilians. I think we have a concrete example which deserves to be recognized as a piece of good international practice. And just finally on the issue of labels, yes, okay, well labels are handed down, and this can become a genuine constraint. And I think sort of following on from the MSF point, that where there is really important work to be done on engagement, that it can be constrained by the hyper caution amongst some of the international actors as soon as labels have been applied, different sanctions have been applied, and that the job of the UN mission on the ground is to work out, in a sense, what's the extent of the envelope, what's permissible, how far you can get without actually incurring legal liability problems both with headquarters and host state, and what makes sense in terms of the core principles of your mandate, and push the envelope, operate at the limit of that envelope. And there are ways indeed of engaging with actors who are on many of the lists.
Thank you very much. IPI gendered rules of moderation expect me to give the floor next to a female colleague on the panel. So it's my pleasure to give you the floor, maybe to address either this question or an additional one.
I hope it's more than just because I'm a woman, though.
I said gender.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to respond to Chris's question on labeling, and I agree with you that these are labels that we get from member states and that the member states determine. But I think there are a number of things that we can do. And as a secretariat and as peace operations, there are three things in particular. I think one is in our analysis. We can be much more nuanced and much more fine in how we understand those groups that are labeled as terrorists or extremists, and then in our proposals for recommendations to the Security Council, and then also within missions to senior management on how to respond and how to manage the threat or the existence of these armed groups, I think we can overcome the labeling issue. And then, of course, we also report to the Security Council, and language is extremely important. The terminology we use, is extremely. Words have weight. Obviously, it's kind of like an obvious thing to say, but maybe we should be thinking of using more neutral terms that are based in IHL or international law, instead of using politicized terminology that also somehow will have an impact on our mission's ability to engage and to do its political work. And the other point I would say is that as part of this non-state armed group project we've been doing, One of the points we're making to our field colleagues is that because there is a sanctions regime that may have designated a group as a terrorist group, that does not necessarily mean that a UN peace operation or that UN actors are prohibited from engaging with those armed groups. And there's often some confusion around that. And of course, there's a difference between UN actors and NGOs on that and the sort of the liabilities that may be incurred. But that's a point that we've been trying to make to our colleagues in the field quite a bit.
Thank you very much. These are really very important points. From my experience, it challenges the leadership at the mission head level, whether you interpret the mandate as a floor or a ceiling. And then you find out ways of navigating those aspects. I'd like to give the floor to Adam, and maybe any comments you have on what you've heard so far, but particularly with respect to the unarmed civilian protection issue. Thank you.
Thanks. Maybe I'll just make a quick comment on Chris's question about lack of control of labeling. I think an often unseen lack of control is how you prioritize armed groups. And in the MONUSCO experience, there was often a tension between what the government wanted us to focus on as a priority armed group, what the council designated as the top three, and what the actual most immediate threat to civilians might be. And there are stories about Martin Kobler, the former SRSG, really trying to push back on that in the period right after the M23, when the government wanted to create a different set of priorities. And I won't try to answer the question, but I think there's often a dilemma that when you decide to prioritize one group and put your resources towards it, it is going to be at the cost of focusing on other groups. And often there are big picture political objectives that may not perfectly align with immediate protection risks. And I think that's one of the key issues to identify in peacekeeping. One of the clarifying things that I think Ralph points to is if you have a policy on how to prioritize protection, it is actually helpful in those dilemmas. And I think that's an area for maybe further policy development as well, possibly. On unarmed approaches, I'll just make two very quick points. I think the UN has a real value added in a number of areas, but one of them is to connect local issues with national issues. Finding out ways of understanding how people in the capital are puppeteering groups in the periphery and how they can also help meet the needs of the groups in the periphery in meaningful ways. One example is we met with the Hutu and Nande parliamentary caucuses in Kinshasa and talked about how their constituencies in the peripheries, what their needs were, and then we also met with the groups in the peripheries. And I think that local national connection is an area where the UN can have a real role to play, and Somalia is an example where that is happening now. And the second one is the ability to bring the margins to the center. The tendency of many of the armed groups is to have male-only conferences with just the combatants, and I think the UN has a real role to bring in a broader group of people, women and youth in particular, into these discussions. And so those would be two areas of unarmed strategies where I think the UN has a clear value added.
Thank you very much, Adam. Agnes?
Yes, thank you. On the labeling, I can only relate to what Naomi said and on what you put forward in terms of necessity to use a much finer analysis on how those groups operate and who they really are, and also the requirement to use more neutral language. And the Geneva Conventions and other treaty laws offer that kind of language that has been agreed by states, by the way. So our role, ICRC, in that process, we engage a lot with states at the Security Council in particular, but also in the UNGA, to make sure that, that their language is as much possible IHL proofed, and to flag also those labeling and the potential consequences they may have in terms of humanitarian consequences. Sometimes we go also public, and last year there were different statements made by officials in Europe, very problematic in our views, about the situation of foreign fighters and their families, and using a very dehumanizing language, and basically amounting to say that those people, they don't deserve protection and they are outside of any kind of legal framework. And so we organize a public conference to actually raise attention on that and saying that it's wrong and it's damageful, and including for the work of humanitarian organizations like ICRC and MSF. On the issue of legitimacy, and I mean a related one, I just would like to share an example of a tool that is used by some organizations, in particular Geneva Call, which is called a deed of commitment. I mentioned earlier this profound, intrinsic legal imbalance between a state and a non-state armed groups. And one of the tools that was designed somehow was to offer the possibility to armed groups to make a pledge, to commit to actually respect specific categories of population, or to make a public commitment. And recently, we managed, for instance, ICRC to secure a commitment by armed factions in a refugee camp in Lebanon, for instance, where they committed to safe passage of ambulance. This is, related to this issue of legitimacy. It's more about also reputation, but this kind of tools are very pragmatic and, let's say, win-win avenues for engagement and for changing behaviors in practice.
Thank you. Last but not least for this round.
Absolutely, thank you. I think touching on most of the questions, a couple points. One, engaging with armed groups is not an end in itself. It's a step towards a larger goal. But in doing so, and I think this goes somewhat to Chris's point or his question about labels, it's not something that happens overnight. I think, we do see that when an armed group, no matter what label it carries, becomes a significant enough threat, whomever, whether it's the council or member states or our own chain of command, whomever is holding us back from engaging with them, there will be pressure to figure something out. And I think you can see that in Afghanistan. And, the early days of Afghanistan, immediately after the invasion in 2001, even the ICRC stopped talking to the Taliban. They were under the impression that the Taliban was a non-entity now. That was obviously, that was a bad analysis of the situation. And over time, they reestablished their contacts, and the mission as well established contacts. And I think that, to try to answer your question, it's both a question of analysis, as Naomi pointed out, keeping your eye on the ball in terms of even if there are armed groups that you're not supposed to be talking to, try to continue to understand them. Analysis really can be relatively cheap in a peace operation. It's not necessarily a resource-heavy endeavor. And then we also have to keep in mind that engaging with armed groups is not something that happens overnight. It often does require that commitment over time to build relations, which is extremely important. With regards to the colleague from MSF, it's a fantastic historical question regarding the whether engaging armed groups has become more common in peace operations. Yusuf and Jack maybe could answer it better than I can. I do have the sense that non-state armed groups have taken on increasing prominence, in great part, I think, because of the kinds of conflicts that peace operations are faced with, and the age of some of our operations. When we've had a mission in DRC for almost 2 decades, you have to begin to ask yourself, what role engaging these groups politically plays. And Adam spearheaded some fantastic work a few years ago with developing tailored strategies for each of these groups and treating them, not as specific entities and not sort of a amorphous group of bad guys. Security is a huge concern, and I think we see that particularly in Mali. So it may be something better covered by the next panel, but it is certainly, I mean, I know it's a concern for humanitarians, and it is for peacekeepers as well.
Thank you. According to my old watch, we have about 10 minutes left. If there is a burning question, I'd like to take it. The reason I'm saying burning, because I want to give the floor one more time to the panel. If you look at your program, it says engaging with armed groups for the protection of civilians. This is the title of our session. I normally summarize what I feel are the takeaways. I'm going to do the opposite this time. I'm going to challenge our panelists by thinking about what would they say in a closing maximum 1-minute statement if the title of our session were to read engaging with armed groups for the protection of civilians and the creation of a space for politics and peace. What would they say? So I just want to add the politics and peace just to echo the larger goal that you've talked about. While they are thinking, I'm willing to entertain 1 or 2 additional questions because I promise I will get back to you after the first round. Jake, microphone here.
I'm going to abuse my privilege as a member of IPI to ask a question, but the issue of analysis and fine-grained understanding of the motivations of armed groups has come up a lot. And I think Afghanistan is quite instructive where, I mean, here was a conflict where you had the intelligence agencies of most of the great powers, some of the richest nations on earth with some of the largest intelligence agencies with deep connections to the conflict going back years, often supporting and working with many of these armed groups, and yet they fundamentally misread the motivations of the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. So I guess my question for all of you is, to what extent are we kidding ourselves about our ability to really understand not just the structures, but the motivations of the groups that we engage with? Thanks.
Thank you for bringing up that very simple question, Jake. I'm not intended to open yet another panel, but it's a critical one. How we listen. What is it for? Are we listening with the intent to understand or with the intent to solve or help? And therefore, it really puts a different lens. If we are there to listen with the intent to understand, they may have a terrible worldview that we do not agree with. And then you take that into account. But if the ultimate is to help neutralize or solve, then you're going to listen from a different, and your analysis is by necessity skewed. So I'm going to give it back to the floor to answer Jake's question, since I don't see really another burning question. So we really finish. I see 2 burning questions. Make it quicker. Make it quick, sir. Go ahead.
Well, thank you very much. So my question was really sort of an attempt...
Can you tell us a little bit?
Oh, I'm sorry. So I'm Dugukolo Bakonare. I'm the founder of KISAL, which is a human rights organization working in the Sahel.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we have spoken about non-state armed groups, and we have spoken about the UN and states as well. And I really wanted to bring attention on the middle persons, organizations of mediation, for instance, with which we work a lot to engage with non-state armed groups. And sometimes it seems like their agendas shift the focus from certain non-state armed groups to others, and from grassroots societies and organizations too. And I would like to know what members of the panel think about that. You know, that sort of disruption that is caused by mediators getting attention on the people that they do know. Thanks.
Okay. I'm going to take your question like I his, but I do not promise you that we will give the time for the panel. If you are here for the next one, these are very relevant questions also to the next panel that will follow immediately this one. But go ahead, sir, and ask it.
Sure. Patrick Labuda, New York University. I'm just a very quick question. Does it matter and should it matter to the UN whether it engages with non-state armed groups in countries where the host state is illegitimate? So this is flipping the question in a way. I'm thinking primarily of places like South Sudan and the Democratic Republic of Congo. And so this question is directed primarily, I think, at Naomi. Should the UN calibrate its response, in relation to how we perceive, and I mean the international community, how the international community perceives the host state?
Okay. All wonderful, easy, simple questions, and we have 5 minutes. With the indulgence of the chair of the next session, since he asked the first complex question, he will be penalized for springing it at the last minute. So I'm turning now to the panelists. You have less than 1 minute, basically, so just in headlines, really, and with the understanding that I promise we will pick it up more fully in the next session. I'm looking at my colleague, the chair of the next session. So I'll start with you.
All right.
And I'm counting.
So, Yusuf, for your 1 minute summary, the protection of a civilian's mandate can really inform a mission's political strategy and help it deal with the political dilemmas raised by when it comes to engaging with armed groups. Jake, I think on the analysis question, and Michael can probably answer the Afghanistan specifics better, but I think it is possible. It's certainly not easy, and I think we often know more than we act upon, and that is one of the biggest challenges. I mean, we have good analysts; they produce good product. But whether the right decisions are taken based on that is a different story.
Thank you, Naomi, and maybe if you could touch very briefly on either of the other two questions as you go along.
Okay. So just to that last question, the short answer is yes. Whether we should calibrate our responses in line with the perceptions of host states. I mean, I think in all conflict environments, when you're thinking about whether or not to engage and how to engage with a non-state armed group, you can't just look at that armed group in isolation. You have to look at the totality of the landscape and think about, the ramifications and the implications of what you're trying to do. So yes is the answer. And then in terms of takeaways and headlines, I would say 3 things. First of all, analyze better, and to your point, Adam, also with humility and honesty, I think. Second, take calculated risks. And third, think about your political goals. And in a way, that is the most important thing. That often we don't do that. We just think in the short term of what we want to achieve now, but we're not thinking what we're trying to achieve in that particular country over a longer period of time.
Thank you very much, Agnes.
Thank you. So I will just use my time to elaborate a bit more on the mediation. Actually, ICRC also is seeking best practices from mediators, from civil affairs component of UN missions, more broadly, to see what are the commonalities between humanitarian negotiation and political mediation, because there are overlapping aims, definitely. So we are also enlarging a bit our skill set and mindset on those things, and we will soon pilot some projects with some communities who have asked us to support their capacities to negotiate themselves with non-state armed groups and other weapon bearers, and not only using ICRC as a neutral intermediary or as a buffer or as a protective shield, but do it themselves, but with some capacities. So we are working on that. And I can just mention, to do some advertisement about a report issued by ICRC a few months ago. There are some exemplaries over there. It's called The Roots of Restraints in War. It's a study focusing a lot on armed groups, but not only, also on armed forces, on how to, and it's a tool also for organizations like the UN to analyze what are the best leverage from social values, from socialization of norms we can use with those weapon bearers.
Thank you very much. Professor Sempley, since you're the one who opened the door for reminding us how to create a space for politics and peace, I'd like to ask you to only focus on this issue. We don't have the time to address the other question. How do we engage with armed groups, not only for the purpose of protection of civilian, but also create space for politics and peace?
There are times when the constraints on the political process are such that there is only space for engagement on protection or humanitarian issues. That's all that's available. I think that we have enough experience to suggest that that can be a helpful placeholder, that it keeps doors open, builds relationships, which are then accessible when the opportunity comes that it's to address political issues and start move towards peace. So the hypothesis is that if we have availed of that engagement opportunity, then we are more likely to succeed when something happens which makes it possible to talk politics. And I will say something about the analysis, which, of course, it is absolutely dependent. Of course, we can answer these questions, but do we have a political strategy to ensure that the policymakers actually use the right analysis instead of choosing to use that analysis which justifies what they're already doing?
Thank you very much. My last good friend, I don't want to violate the human rights of the next chairperson, so please, to the point.
I'll use my 1 minute just to make a point that political solutions do not equal the state. As Patrick said, the state can be predatory. I'd add that so-called armed groups can provide a surprising amount of governance capacity in some of these settings. And if you look at the UN state building project over the last 30 years or so, the attempt to deal with insecurity by extending state authority, I don't think it's delivered much. As opposed to what it was aiming to do. I don't think now is the time to double down on the state. It's time to look more at non-state modes of governance, more flexible policy modalities for engaging with this broader group of actors around providing security. And I will end with a concrete proposal or a question. What would happen if we added to the capstone doctrine, you have consent, impartiality, defensive use of force, and a fourth one, protection, to force that dilemma into the principle level?
Wonderful. All good things come to an end. I'm afraid our time is up. Please join me in thanking our panelists for an excellent contribution.